Hello again, everyone. This is the second part of our A-level economics revision exam booster session, looking at behavioral economic policies. You'll remember that from part one, we looked at what behavioral economics is and why governments use it in a form of policy making. We looked at choice architecture, nudge theory, and framing as three forms of behavioral economic policies. And in this session, we're going to continue on by looking at defaulted choice, restricted choice, and mandated choice. We're then going to spend some time looking at the overall evaluation of behavioral economic policies. And that will be very useful when you look at your final evaluation paragraphs in your 25-mark essay questions. This session is slightly shorter than part one. So the first one I'm going to go straight into is looking at defaulted choice. So this is an aspect of consumer behavior theory which states consumers will stick with regular spending patterns and we are much more likely to choose the easiest option we are given. Now, there are different forms of looking at a defaulted choice. You can look at the idea that we as a consumer often create our own defaulted choices based on our own spending patterns. So if we always buy the same thing, we always go for the default, that can ultimately be seen as the defaulted choice. Now that can be very easily confused with habitual behavior. You could argue that habitual behavior leads to the creation of a defaulted choice for the individual consumer. You can also look at a defaulted choice, and certainly the governments would look at it in this way, in which they choose the choice for you. You then have a choice as do you accept the defaulted choice or do you accept other possible choices that are also given to you, but the default is the desirable choice. So again, we can look at that from two sides of the coin. We can look at it from the point of view of the consumer has their own defaulted choice and the governments can create a defaulted choice. The governments can also look at what is our defaulted choice, and then how could they change our decision making and change our degree of choice in order for us to create a new defaulted choice. And that new defaulted choice would be deemed desirable by the government. In the real world, we often purchase the goods and services that we are presented as the automatic defaulted choice, often the status quo. So again, status quo bias can create defaulted choice. We don't take the option to opt out or choose something else. Why defaulted choices are popular. Consumers don't want to spend time looking around to see if there is something out there that is slightly better. We do see examples of this, particularly with things like bounded rationality. Remember that consumers suffer from bounded rationality. They suffer from imperfect information. They suffer from a limited mental processing ability. They also suffer from time constraints. And if you think about what we looked at before with time constraints, individuals suffer from both think one and think two. Think fast and think slow, system one and system two thinking. They don't want to spend time calculating the costs and benefits of such a decision, and therefore they stick with the default choice. The default choice is, for me, semi-skimmed milk. There are other choices of milk out there, but I always drink semi-skimmed. Therefore, for me, that is the defaulted choice. I'm not going to spend time weighing up the costs and benefits of changing from one to the other. Changing a product or service may give a long-term benefit. So what we recognize with a defaulted choice is that when we do choose outside the default, when we go for the other option that isn't the default choice, or isn't what we perceive to be, well, it's always the one we've had, therefore we always stick with it. We look at the idea that it could be in our long-term best interests for us to choose another option. But we focus too much, individuals are too much focused on the short term. So in the short term, there are costs, for example, time involved in making a switch, therefore we stick with the default. This is a deterrent to changing from what we have. So for example, people will often stick with their bank accounts. So my account is held with Bank of Ireland. I see no reason as to why I should switch that bank account The first main reason would be ultimately that I now live in England and now Northern Ireland. So if anything happened to my card, I would have a branch that I could physically go into here, but I have never had the need for that. If I was to change, I'd have to let the school know of my new sort code and account number. I'd have to stop all my direct debits, change all the details of my standing order. There'll be issues then with your mortgage, with any payments that you would have, etc. There would be too much hassle, so to speak. So I'll stick with what I have. I work for Bank of Ireland, and therefore the defaulted choice of a bank account to have was with them. I stick with what I've always had, status quo. The uncertainty of changing. Remember, we are risk averse. Individuals do not like the idea or notion of change. They are averse to risk. They don't like the unknown. They like to stick with what they've got and stick with what they've always had. If we stick with the defaulted choice, we know what we are going to get. If we change, we may get better, but we may also get worse. So there is that fear, there is that risk that things could get better, but they could also get worse as well. And individuals will often put too much of a heavy weighting on suspecting and anticipating that things will go worse rather than better. Therefore, the certainty of staying with what we have is more appealing. This explains the popularity of strong brands such as Coca-Cola and with Starbucks. If we go abroad to a foreign country, we walk into a shop or to a restaurant and we see a whole array of drinks that we've never heard of before, because we've never lived in that country. We're not used to the cultural diversity in their menus and in their drinks. We see Coca-Cola there, we say, yeah, I'll stick with that because I know it's tried and tested. We associate the same level of quality in that country that what we would get from our home country. When we travel, we can rely on minimum standards of service if we go to these brands we know. Again, hotel chains. The reason why we like hotel chains is, if I stay in a Premier Inn in London, if I stay in a Premier Inn in Bristol, I'll get the same level of quality. We stick with what we know rather than maybe testing out some of the independently owned hotels whenever we're there. There is a saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. In reality, people may use this as a rough rule of thumb for purchases and spending patterns. When looking at forms, we often don't take time to read options and choose alternatives. We accept the option that is given, and I've given you a few examples. There certainly is a really good one, I think, in your work booklets, as when you're completing a form, that choice has been made for you. We see defaulted choice with things like they automatically give you the defaulted choice of next day delivery, for example, and you're thinking, well, I don't need it straight away. I could wait the 5 or 6 delivery days. So I'll choose that and get it for free rather than have to pay the next day delivery. Implications or evaluation of a defaulted choice. It manipulates decision making. Because you're making the choice for them, you're almost in effect treating consumers like they're not capable of making a rational decision, and therefore you have to step in, make the choice for them, and fingers crossed and hope that they continue with the choice that you have made for them. In terms of the individual making or creating their own defaulted choice, it goes against the view that consumers choose goods depending on marginal utility or price. So if we create a situation in which we create a defaulted choice, we are making the assumption that the individual is not capable of weighing up the choices available to them and selecting the one which will maximize their true utility. It means that the individual will stick with the choice they always go with, but that choice may not be useful or may not lead to that individual maximizing their utility. And so if the governments encourage people to select the defaulted choice, whilst the government is achieving their objective of a desired outcome, is the individual maximizing their true utility. And what you need to do there is you need to weigh up which is greater. Is the desirable outcome from government for society the most effective option, or is it a case that in actual fact, the individual is not having the chance to maximize their utility? Which is better, true maximization of the utility for the individual or achieving the government objectives? And is that desired outcome, remember, that's based on a value judgment. The value judgment that governments will make is based upon what they perceive to be the most rational outcome. And that may not be the same as what individual consumers would want. So again, think very carefully and weigh up the costs and benefits between both. We see examples here of defaulted choices and examples of defaulted choices through donor cards, in terms of people donating blood and people also donating their organs. Now, in the UK, there was an issue in terms of there are more people in the UK, and therefore there's greater issues with people requiring blood donations and organ donations. But the number of people stepping forward to say that they would be willing to donate their organs or willing to donate their blood in the event that they would have to is very low. And of course, you cannot force people to donate their blood or their organs. That has to be a mutual decision in which the governments encourage people to do it, but we still have the freedom of choice not to. And people have various reasons as to why they wouldn't, and that it must be respected as well. Some countries automatically assume people are willing to donate organs unless they opt out. Other countries adopt the other approach. The default choice is that permission is not granted unless you carry a donor card and opt into the scheme. So in some countries, governments will say only those who step forward and are willing to donate their blood and organs can be donors. However, recently that law has changed in the UK. It's now an opt-out scheme in which every one of us now are, in government's form, we are a organ donor, and we will be approached should somebody require our organs. And we will also be able to opt out of that scheme. So that degree of choice still remains. We are all automatically enrolled, but we do have the freedom of choice to opt out of that scheme. Restricted choice. Because of the existence of bounded rationality, consumers can find it really difficult to make effective decisions when the number of choices or options is large. This may result in them failing to make any decision at all. Now, restricted choice, the clue is in the name. The individual still possesses a degree of choice, but the amount of options given to them has been restricted. Okay, so where they would have had 5 options before, they now only have 3. And that's designed to overcome the issue of choice overload. Behavioral economics believe that through cognitive biases, individuals are unable to make the most effective or rational choice because there's too many choices available to them. And that often either slows up the decision-making process because there's too many options to weigh through the cost and benefits of each, or it may also prevent the individual from selecting what is deemed to be the most rational choice or the most desirable outcome in the government's eyes. We see examples of restricted choices in school menus. So for example, in our school, you are allowed chips, you're allowed fish and chips on a Friday, but that's restricted to 1 day in the week. So children are allowed to have access to chips. They are allowed to have access to slightly fattier foods than what they normally would have done. The idea that individuals would also be able to make a quicker decision could speed up the fact that they wouldn't have to weigh through the more irrational decisions. Therefore, restricting the number of available choices may be more likely to cause consumers to act and actually make a decision, resulting in more efficient outcomes. Some examples of where we see restricted choice, really good to add these into essays, but look at the context of the essay that's been given and how can you use these examples to back up how useful it would be for others. To encourage more healthy eating in schools, choices can remain available, but restricted for children. For example, not allowing fatty foods on the lunch menus, not permitting sugary drinks and drinks in vending machines, and not allowing children to consume food outside of the school grounds. So if you think about this, we are not denying children the right to eat or drink in school, but we have a significant degree of control over what they eat and how that menu is designed. So yes, children can drink, they can quench their thirst, they will not go thirsty when they are on school site, but they will not drink sugary drinks. They'll drink water or fruit juice instead that contain significantly less sugar than normal sugary drinks. They can have fatty foods, but that will be restricted on a diet basis. They're not having pizza and chips every day. They can have it maybe once a week. To control the excess demand for school places, governments can use the idea of restricted choice to allow parents to apply to schools only in their local areas. If you think about it, in areas where schools are very popular, governments have to almost think that every parent will want to send their child to the best school. But we don't want parents sending their children, busing them out of the local areas and into other local areas. We don't want one borough to be flooded with applications and other boroughs go with no kids in them at all. Schools are there to cater for their local communities. The government will look at the idea that you've got a choice of 6 schools within the local authority. You now must rank them from 1 to 6. So you still have a degree of choice as to where you send your child, but it must be either one, it has to be one of these 6 schools, and you rank them from 1 to 6. So parents and children still have the degree of choice, but that choice is restricted. Restricting the number of takeaways in certain locations, governments can look at the idea that if in some areas we experience a rising levels of obesity, if we were to allow another takeaway in that area, could that lead to further levels of obesity? So therefore, we restrict the number of takeaways in certain areas to prevent rising levels of obesity and also to prevent significantly high levels of competition in those areas. So if we have a large number of takeaways, they will compete through price. If they compete through price, they're likely to lower the price, therefore making takeaway fatty, unhealthy foods even more cheaper, which would fuel the demand for the good. Public smoking bans restricting your activity. So with public smoking, you are not allowed to smoke in a public building. But if you want to smoke, you can, but it's restricted as to where you can smoke. Mandated choices. A mandated choice is a situation or scenario in which people must decide in advance to whether they wish to participate in a particular action. They are required by law to make that particular type of choice. And we see quite a lot of examples with the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen a number of mandated choices becoming available to us. So if we look at, for example, a mandated choice is a variant of defaulted choice, except that the choices are mandated through the force of law, statutory regulations. So if I use the example here, with a standard defaulted choice, if it's almost like it's advised you take that one, so therefore go and take it. If you don't take it, there's no law imposed against you. With a mandated choice, look at the example of face masks. The government were saying, you are allowed to go into a retail space, you are allowed to go into a shop, and you are allowed to purchase goods and services. But if you want to do that, you must wear a face mask. So you are given the choice to do the act that you want, which is shop in a retail space. But your ability to do that act is influenced by statutory laws, which state in order for you to go shopping, you must wear a face mask unless you are exempt from that. Examples are the decision in the UK in the summer of 2020 to make mask wearing compulsory in retail shops and on public transport. Again, you are allowed to use public transport. There's no issue with you using public transport, but you must, by law, wear a face mask when you do decide to use public transport. Will the UK government bring in some system of mandated vaccination passport, or for those wanting to travel overseas. So again, there's another example. We are saying, yes, you are allowed to travel overseas, but in order for you to do so, by law, you must complete a PCR test and it must be negative. You must also show that you have been vaccinated. The further examples there are employers asking for a vaccination certificate to prove that individuals are fit to work. So again, you have a choice to work, but in order to work, you must have a vaccine. Evaluation of some behavioral policies. Now, these are in your work booklets. So let's have a look at the overall evaluation of behavioral policies. Now, this is your final conclusion, your DISCOM. Decide. It depends on short run versus a long run, cost, opportunity cost, other factors, most important factor, your recommendation at the end of it. So it's likely you'll be asked, do you believe in traditional or do you believe in behavioral? Often behavioral policies are untested. They are unpredictable and only likely to work to change minor behavior. So behavioral economics is good. I personally am a believer of behavioral economics, but I am realistic as to how effective it will be. It will be effective in the degree of the behavior. If it's minor behavior, behavioral economics is good. If it's more deep-rooted, historical, psychologically deep-rooted behavior, then behavioral economics alone is not the best policy. It can work, but it's not strong enough to work on its own. So look at the degree of strength behind behavioral policies in changing both minor and long-term deep-rooted behavior. Is it too manipulative? Are we treating consumers like they're stupid? Are we treating consumers like they are unable to make a rational decision? Are we insulting consumers? Is the government at risk of controlling too much their behavior? We have seen with the COVID pandemic how people have took to the streets in protest of being forced to stay home because they don't want to. We have seen people in protest of wearing face masks because they believe the governments are controlling too much of their decisions and their lives. With behavioral economics, there's quite a large amount of administrative costs. It is quite an expensive form of government policies to roll out. Would they even work and would they even be successful? So if you spend money on something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. There could be a potential risk that it is not successful. And if it's not successful and the governments have spent that money, is there risk then of government failure? Money has been spent to correct market failure, but it hasn't led to the correction of market failure at all. It's led to a worsening of the situation. People have ignored the nudge policies. Okay, think very carefully about that. You could nudge people as much as you like, but they could choose to ignore it. Is the government becoming too paternalistic? Are they controlling too much of our behavior? Are they controlling too much of our daily lives? What is the degree of paternalistic behavior? Yes, I believe we need some form of intervention. We need some form of direction from a government, but too much can break a society. Is information provision actually better? What is actually the deep-rooted cause of irrational behavior? Is it cognitive biases, or is it simply that individuals are not aware that what they're doing is leading to irrational behavior? So forget behavioral policies and simply just educate people and provide information instead. It is very difficult to get everyone to move together or herd in one direction. People are predictably irrational. It is likely that when a decision is made, most people will make an irrational one. And it is very, very difficult. And I know this for myself. You have one vision and trying to get people to follow that vision can be very difficult, depending on the circumstances that you find yourself in. So the governments have had a real time on their hands trying to get people to behave in a way that takes their safety and the safety of others during the COVID-19 pandemic. Conventional shove policies such as taxation, subsidies, and regulation are also effective. Price is still a very important element in decision making, Nudge policies should be seen as a complementary to these traditional or classical policies. They should not be seen as standalone policies. We need to look at what can be used alongside behavioural policies. So conventional shove policies such as taxation, subsidies, and regulation are also effective. Price is still a very important determinant in decision making. Nudge policies should be seen as complementary to those traditional classical policies. If you think about again, weighing up, the question is likely to ask, do you believe in traditional or do you believe do you believe in traditional or do you believe in behavioural? The right answer to give is that the both should work side by side. Behavioural should complement the traditional policies. So policies such as taxation, subsidies, regulation are also effective. Use them alongside behavioural methods. And we see examples there of how, when I move on to the integrated approach, talking about how, for example, revenue from taxation could be used to cover the administrative costs of behavioural economic policies. Are these problems so deep-rooted? And why are they so deep-rooted? So there's a reason why people behave in the way that they do. Try and find out that reason. And is behavioural really enough, or do you need a team approach, both traditional and behavioural working together? They may lose their impact over time. There was a time when you could have said things to people and they would have believed it or would have taken it more seriously than what they maybe would have done so now. People have a greater, broader mindset now than what they've ever had before through things like the internet, social media, for example. There's greater influences in society now than maybe what there would have been so before. Behavioral economics is not a replacement for classical thought, but should be used as a complement to such thinking. An integrated approach should be employed. So our real recommendation is that behavioral economics is fantastic, but it cannot be used as a sole policy. It has to, if you want to get the most desired outcome, work alongside other policies such as taxation, subsidies, minimum maximum prices, regulation, for example. Traditional should work alongside behavioral or conventional shove policies. When you talk about an integrated approach, justify that. So for example, the revenue gain from taxes could be used to cover the administrative costs of behavioral policies. Okay. I hope that you have found that useful. I hope that that will be useful for your exams and in your essays. Please do read your work booklet from cover to cover because there is other information in there as well. So these revision videos, both part 1 and part 2, are designed to supplement your revision and study at home. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope that you find that useful and enjoyable, and best of luck with your revision and your exams.